If you have shot Canon for any length of time, chances are at least one of these lenses has either been in your camera bag or on your wish list. Some became wedding and event workhorses. Others built Canon's reputation for extraordinary portrait glass, and one became so recognizable that it practically looked like professional Canon photography itself. These are the 5 greatest Canon lenses ever made, and number 1 helped define an entire era. You are watching Alt Buzz Lenses. Subscribe for the stories behind the lenses photographers used, trusted, and remembered. At number 5, we have the Canon EF 50mm f1.2 L USM. This is not the lens you choose because it is technically perfect. It is the lens you choose because of how it makes a face disappear from a background, how it softens the world at the edges of the frame, while leaving just enough sharpness to hold your eye. Photographers who owned this lens rarely talked about test charts. They talked about the way it rendered a bride walking through afternoon light, or the way a subject's eyes could feel impossibly sharp, while everything else dissolved into something closer to memory than photograph. Canon had already proven what its mount could do with the earlier EF 50mm f1.0, an almost experimental lens that showed the outer limits of what the EF system was built to handle. The f1.2 version took that same ambition and turned it into something photographers could actually carry, actually afford, actually use on a paid job. It became a fixture at weddings, in documentary work, in low light where slower lenses simply gave up. It was never the easiest lens to focus. At its widest aperture, the depth of field was thin enough that a subject leaning forward could shift entirely out of focus, and its wide-open rendering was softer than more modern, more clinically corrected designs. None of that stopped photographers from returning to it again and again. Long-term rental data consistently places this lens among the most requested Canon primes, evidence that this was never a shelf lens. It was a working lens, chosen deliberately, flaws and all. Its imperfections were not a weakness in the story. They were the entire reason people kept choosing it long after cleaner, easier alternatives existed. The 50 became famous for character. The next lens took that same fast prime philosophy and turned it into one of the most recognizable portrait tools of the entire DSLR era. At number 4, we have the Canon EF 85mm f1.2 L USM. If the 50mm taught photographers to embrace imperfection, the 85mm taught them what Canon was truly capable of the moment it aimed a lens directly at the human face. This is the lens that became inseparable from portrait photography, from fashion sets, from weddings where the photographer wanted one frame that felt less like documentation and more like a painting. Canon had built an autofocus 85mm f1.2 before this version ever existed, and the fact that the company returned to the idea, refined it, and kept it alive across another generation says something the specification sheet alone cannot. This was never a one-time experiment. It was a sustained philosophy, a belief that portraiture deserved a tool this extreme. At f1.2 and typical portrait distances, the plane of focus could measure in mere centimeters. A subject exhaling could be enough to shift focus off an eye. That demanded real skill from the person holding the camera, and photographers who mastered it were rewarded with a kind of subject separation few other lenses of that era could offer. The second version answered one of the most common complaints about the original by improving autofocus performance, though it never became a fast-action lens by any definition. It remained deliberate, demanding, and entirely worth the trouble for the photographers who built their reputation around it. It was heavy. It was expensive. Focusing it well took practice most photographers only gained through repetition. But other brands had fast portrait primes too. What set Canon apart was the willingness to keep pushing this specific idea, generation after generation, until an aperture number became shorthand for an entire aesthetic. The 85 represented what Canon could do with a single focal length pushed to its limit. Number 3 arrived decades later, and used an entirely new mount to challenge what photographers expected from a zoom. At number 3, we have the Canon RF 28 to 70mm F2 L USM. For years, the professional standard zoom meant one thing: 24 to 70mm at f2.8. Canon changed the terms of that conversation entirely with the arrival of the R mount, offering a zoom that started slightly longer, ran through 70mm, and held a constant aperture of f2 throughout. That single change moved a zoom lens into territory that used to belong exclusively to fast primes. The real question this lens forced photographers to ask was whether one zoom could genuinely replace the collection of primes many of them carried on a wedding or event shoot. It could not fully replicate the character of a dedicated 35mm or 50mm prime at f1.4, and the brief never pretends otherwise. What it did was narrow that gap enough to change how photographers actually packed their bags. Enough that some began leaving primes at home entirely and trusting this single lens to carry an entire assignment. There is a deeper story here about what Canon was trying to say with the R mount itself. Early mirrorless marketing across the industry leaned heavily on smaller, lighter, more compact systems. Canon used this lens to argue the opposite. A mirrorless mount was not just an excuse to shrink a camera system. It could also enable optical designs more ambitious than anything the older EF mount ever allowed. That came at a real cost. The lens was large, heavy, carried no image stabilization, and demanded a price that put it firmly in professional territory. Plenty of photographers found it simply too much lens to carry every day. Its greatness was never about convenience. It was about ambition, and in the years since, more manufacturers have followed with their own extremely fast professional zooms, making this early Canon experiment look more significant in hindsight than it may have seemed at launch. The 28 to 70 became great because it was unusual. Number 2 became great for the opposite reason. Photographers could use it for almost anything. At number 2, we have the Canon EF 24 to 70mm f2.8 L USM. This is where the story shifts away from exotic specifications and towards something far more meaningful in professional photography: repetition. Greatness in this chapter does not come from doing something no other lens could do. It comes from being the lens a working photographer trusted every single time a client was paying for the result. This lens arrived during the peak years of Canon's DSLR dominance, mounted constantly on bodies like the 5D Mark III, the 5D Mark IV, and the 1D series that professionals carried into everything from weddings to press conferences. The 24 to 70mm range covered an enormous share of what a working photographer actually needed on any given day: a wide environmental frame at one end, a tight, intimate portrait at the other, without ever changing lenses. That is exactly why so many photographers reached for it first when an assignment began, before they even knew what the day would ask of them. The constant f2.8 aperture gave photographers something just as valuable as sharpness: predictability. Indoor events, dim reception halls, overcast afternoons. None of it required a mental recalculation, because the exposure behavior stayed consistent throughout the entire zoom range. And here lies one of the strongest pieces of evidence in this entire ranking. Across long-term rental history, this lens sits at the very top, more requested than almost anything else Canon has ever made. That statistic alone does not make it the best lens Canon ever built, but it proves something equally important. Its professional footprint was enormous, large enough that no serious Canon retrospective could rank it anywhere but near the very top. The 24 to 70 went to work, every single day, on every kind of job imaginable. The final lens on this list became something even more recognizable: a lens people could identify from across a room or across the sidelines of a stadium. At number 1, we have the Canon EF 70 to 200mm f2.8 L IS II USM. Canon has built faster lenses, rarer lenses, sharper lenses, and far more exotic optics across its long history. But if a single lens had to visually represent professional Canon photography through the entire DSLR era, this is one of the strongest candidates the company has ever produced. Canon's large white telephoto lenses carried a reputation of their own, tied to Olympic coverage, football sidelines, motorsport, wildlife, and major press events around the world. What made this particular lens so significant is that it carried that same white lens identity into a focal range useful far beyond specialist telephoto work. It showed up at weddings, at portrait sessions, at concerts, at indoor sport, at corporate events, on outdoor sidelines, on concert stages, in more genres of professional photography than almost any other Canon lens before it. The second generation of this lens represents the era photographers remember most clearly, improving optical performance, stabilization, and minimum focusing distance in ways that made it noticeably more usable in real professional conditions. A later third generation would refine the formula further, but this is the version that became the standard so many photographers built their careers around. At 70mm, it delivered portraits and documentary detail. At 200mm, it delivered compression, subject isolation, and reach, all while holding the same constant f2.8 aperture throughout the entire range. Even now, long after Canon shifted its professional lineup toward the R mount, photographers continue adapting this exact lens onto their newer bodies. Camera bodies aged faster than this lens did, and that alone says something few optics in Canon's history can claim. It could be argued the 24-70 actually went to more assignments over the years, but the 70-200 became something larger than a workhorse. It became a symbol, immediately recognizable, tied inseparably to Canon's white lens heritage, carried through generation after generation of professional bodies. That gives it a kind of cultural weight numbers alone cannot capture. Before we recap, if these stories are pulling you back into your own memories of shooting Canon glass, take a second and subscribe. This channel exists to keep telling stories like this one. Number 5. The EF 50mm f1.2. Great because of character. Number 4. The EF 85mm f1.2. Great because it defined Canon portrait glass. Number 3. The RF 28-70mm f2. Great because it revealed Canon's mirrorless ambition. Number 2. The EF 24-70mm f2.8. Great because professionals depended on it without fail. Number 1. The EF 70-200mm f2.8. Great because it became part of Canon's professional identity. A few more deserve a mention before we close. The EF 50mm f1.0, the engineering legend that proved what the EF mount could handle. The EF 100mm f2.8 L macro, the quiet workhorse respected across an entire generation of specialists. The EF 135mm f2, still adored today for portraits and stage work. The EF 100-400mm, a defining telephoto zoom for wildlife shooters. And the newer RF 100-500mm, an excellent lens in its own right, simply too recent to outrank decades of proven history. None of this is a shopping list for 2026. A newer RF lens might focus faster, resolve more detail, or stabilize better than every lens on this list. That was never the question. This ranking was built on influence, on trust, on the lenses photographers kept reaching for long after something newer arrived. So tell me, which Canon lens would you have placed at number 1? And which lens do you think deserves a place on this list that I left out? Say it in the comments. I read every single one. If you want more of these stories about the lenses that shaped Canon, Nikon, Sony, Pentax, Leica, and the rest of photography history, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. Cameras change hands, bodies get retired, but a lens like this outlives all of it, quietly waiting on a mount somewhere, still doing exactly what it was built to do.